We're ready to begin our branch technique as we've already sectioned out our primary section that we'll be working in. And we'll be utilizing diagonal foil placement as well as some vertical foil placement and a few horizontals in here as well. The reason we do that is because we'll start off on the right hand side and actually work across, creating more of a pivot using the high point of the head as our reference point and as our pivot point. So we're not actually going to be working the foil straight across, but rather more in a pivot type of motion. You can do all slices or you can do all weaves. It's totally up to you and what your creativity and the end result is that you're looking for. Our first foil is in, and now we're ready to create the branch that resembles somewhat of a tree-like thing. So we'll actually come right across underneath and create somewhat of a little pie section, but coming just to the middle of our very first foil. This is somewhat of a wedge, but if we look at the line that we're working on, it's almost like a branch of a tree that has connected to a main branch of the tree. We've got our smaller branch in now, so I'll need to create another long branch to have a sub branch come off of that. I'll do that by using the rat tail comb and just coming up somewhat on a diagonal. But as you can see, it's not as much of a diagonal as it was before. Now we're starting to get into somewhat of a vertical foil placement because we're working from the top of the head and using this point of reference as our pivot to pivot around to the opposite side. Body position is really important here because I'm going to stand on the right hand side of this technique for the entire process. As I'm using this pivot going across and creating my longer branches and my smaller branches, I'm pulling everything towards my body. If we're standing on the left hand side, we'll do the same thing, but unlike the other techniques that we've done, we don't have to constantly switch sides. It's standing on one side and working all the way across the other on a pivot. You'll notice that the foils begin to end up somewhat of a bricklayer pattern, but instead of a bricklayer pattern being more of a horizontal, we're actually bricklayering because we're pivoting around and using shorter and longer sections of hair. We do want to be careful not to always come back to our point of reference. We just use that as our pivot mark, but if we constantly bring our section that we're going to foil up to this, we'll end up with a spot of color that ends up being at the top of the head and a whole lot of color being there, and we don't necessarily want that to happen. So some of our longer branches may need to be shortened up just a little bit so to avoid that particular area. The small branches are really what helps us out here, keep on the pivot side. Because of the small pieces that we want to have coming towards the middle of our long foil here, that just helps us stay on that pivot. So if we find ourselves trying to go across the head, create one small point or one small branch and more of a diagonal, and that will help us get back on track. This will be the last foil for the section. We've worked our way on over to the opposite side of our beginning part, our beginning triangle, and we'll end this with a long foil that actually ends up being the opposite side of our triangle, of our original triangle. We can pin the hair off to the side, get that out of our client's face, let that process, and we'll come back and check the results once she's completed processing.